UNRWA is effectively a front organisation for Hamas. The majority of employees, as far as I'm aware, of UNRWA inside Gaza are Palestinian civilians. These are not some kind of external aid workers coming in that you could expect to behave impartially. These are Palestinian civilians, and like the majority of Palestinian civilians, as we discussed, they are supporters of Hamas.
Hello everybody and welcome to JTV. I'm really thrilled to say that today we are joined by Colonel Richard Kemp. He served in the British Armed Forces from 1977 to 2006, commander of the British Armed Forces serving in Afghanistan. Colonel Kemp, thank you so much for making the time to be here today. Really, really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure to join you and your viewers and listeners.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm sure all our viewers will really, really appreciate it. Let's just jump into some current affairs issues and then we'll talk about some slightly broader issues. Obviously, right now we've had the ICJ ruling about the absurd case of questioning whether Israel is committing genocide. Cruel, harsh, just a bad faith kind of case that was taken against Israel. What are your immediate thoughts on the outcome of this?
Well, the first thing, I thought it was an obscenity for South Africa to bring this case at all and for the ICJ to hear it. And particularly, and I suspect the whole thing was planned to land somewhere near International Holocaust Memorial Day to make the point, that the absolutely cruel point that they're trying to make, that Israel, having been founded in the immediate aftermath, refounded, should I say, in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, is now committing a genocide itself, which is, of course, completely false and a fabrication and an attempt to undermine the state of Israel rather than to reflect reality. And the findings, I think, of the initial findings, obviously this procedure will go on for a long time now, maybe some years before the ICJ comes to its conclusion. But the initial findings show, I think, the weakness of this case. One thing was that South Africa asked the court to order an immediate ceasefire, an immediate cessation of hostilities, and the court refused to do that. Essentially, although it didn't say that in these words, but endorsing Israel's defensive war against Hamas. And had the court had any real grounds to believe that a genocide was in progress, then of course they would have ordered a halt to hostilities. They didn't do so. And of course they ordered the immediate release of the hostages, which is the right thing to do, but is not going to have any effect because the International Court of Justice only has an effect on democracies and on countries. And of course, Hamas is neither and will simply ignore the ICJ's order.
Absolutely. And we've seen just a ridiculous amount of double standards applied to Israel in terms of military warfare morality. Could you talk our viewers through that a little bit so we understand that these double standards and why the accusations are so flawed about how the IDF have been operating? Because you have been for a long time an advocate of the IDF's just modus operandi, and you really sort of respect the IDF as a British former commander of the armed forces. Can you talk us through that in a bit of detail so we really understand the basics?
Yeah, I mean, it's despite the lies and the twisted truth and the propaganda that goes on, and let's not forget, everyone discussing Israel, that particularly anti-Israel supporters, are speaking against the background of a very, very long and very effective propaganda campaign which has been going on against Israel since the 1960s. And what that campaign tells people, quite wrongly, of course, is that Israel is an illegitimate state, that Israel is an illegal occupier, Israel has illegal settlements, Israel has stolen Palestinian land, all of which are blatant lies and distortions of reality. But that is the truth that has grown through this propaganda campaign, and people believe it, and therefore they believe that almost anything that happens to Israel, Israel had it coming. And in fact, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, said something like that himself at an early stage in the war, that this must not be seen in a vacuum. It's got to be seen against a background of essentially of Israel's offences against the Palestinians, which again is complete nonsense. And so that's the reality. And anything that Israel does is wrong. Everything and anything Israel does is wrong. That is the background. So if you consider that to be the situation that Israel faces, whatever Israel does in prosecuting a war against Hamas, which showed its own genocidal intent on the 7th of October, which its own charter expresses its desire for genocide. Its own leaders have repeatedly said that they intend to carry out a genocide of the Jews in Israel and elsewhere. So you know, against that background, Israel, whatever Israel says, whatever Israel attempts to do, it is distorted and it's ignored. But the truth is that the IDF does everything in its power to try and destroy Hamas, while at the same time trying to limit civilian casualties and civilian harm and damage to civilian property. Now, the reality is that it's impossible to fight an enemy which is using human shields, which has as a deliberate policy the intention of forcing Israel into a situation where it's going to kill Palestinian civilians. That is their objective in order to isolate Israel, in order to grow this propaganda campaign I mentioned. But the truth is the direct opposite of that. And no army in the history of the world, in the history of warfare, has ever taken such extraordinary measures as the IDF has taken in this war and in previous conflicts. And just to give you a couple of very brief examples of that, the IDF, under the laws of war, in compliance with the laws of war, the IDF has warned civilians when they're going to attack targets, whether that's targeted buildings or targeted areas. They've warned them. They've told them where they should go to be safer. They've told them how they should get there, including by dropping millions of maps, leaflets with maps printed on them. And then they've waited until the civilians have left before then attacking the targets. They've sent millions of voice messages, millions of text messages, millions of phone calls, some recorded, some direct personal calls to individuals, warning them again to leave. And again, maintaining surveillance over targets until they can be as sure as they can be that the civilians have left. Meanwhile, Hamas, of course, tries to force the IDF to remain in place. I beg your pardon, tries to force the civilians to remain in place. So there's a higher likelihood of the IDF attacking and killing them. Sometimes it's not possible to attack targets only after all civilians have left. Sometimes it is impossible, and it's not a requirement of the laws of war. The requirement is to warn people, to give them the opportunity to go, and to be careful about the way you attack a target which has got civilians in it. And I think the proof of the pudding in some ways is in the figures that we're seeing now. And Hamas claim, nobody really knows the truth. Hamas claims something like 25,000, the figure changes daily, of course. 25,000 people have been killed in Gaza. That's Hamas's figures. We can't take them seriously, but we don't have any other figures at the moment. So let's for a moment just assume that what Hamas says is somewhere near the truth. Let's assume that, although it probably isn't. But they don't break that down into civilians or combatants or any other category of people. And of course, in among that number, there are civilians who Hamas have killed themselves by rockets dropping short or by deliberate mass murder, which is something they have practiced both during this war and previously, or people who have died from natural causes, of which there are going to be many in a population this size. Those are all included in Hamas's figure. But let's take that figure, let's take 25,000. The IDF have killed, the IDF assess, should I say, because they can't be 100% certain, but they assess they've killed something in the region of 10,000 Palestinian terrorists in Gaza in this conflict since the land war began, something around 10,000. Now, it's an awful thing to reduce human life to statistics, And of course, every civilian death is a tragedy in war. But let's look at the ratios. That means that in this conflict so far, according to IDF figures and Hamas's figures, there's been a ratio of about 1.5 civilians killed to every combatant killed. 1.5 civilians for every combatant. That sounds very bad, and it is bad. But I did say earlier that it's very hard for the IDF, impossible for the IDF to fight without, unfortunately, killing innocent civilians. But if you take that 1.5 to 1 ratio and you compare it to other statistics that have been issued, for example, the United Nations have said in a report they issued some years ago that in conflicts in urban areas, the average civilian to combatant death ratio is 9 civilians to 1 combatant. In Iraq and Afghanistan, estimates suggest that the Americans and their allies killed between 3 and 5 combatants for every, I beg your pardon, 3 and 5 civilians for every combatant. So if you look at those ratios, and as I said before, reducing human life to ratios to statistics is bad, but it's a guide, it's a useful guide to show us that the IDF performance in an urban area where there are civilians present have been significantly better than most other armies, if not every other army, and actually, I think, confirms the effectiveness of the steps that they've been taking, not to commit genocide, but to avoid anything remotely resembling genocide and to minimize civilian death.
Wow. And how do we, who is providing the information on whether the deaths are Hamas fighters or non sort of civilians in Gaza? Who's providing that information?
Well, the IDF estimate the only reliable figures we have relating to the distinction between civilians and combatants are the IDF assessment of how many they have killed, how many terrorists they've killed. They haven't assessed how many civilians have died in that process, and that's why we have to look at. We can only really look at Hamas's figures for what they're worth. But the IDF estimate is about 10,000 civilians killed.
And what are your thoughts on?
I beg your pardon, not civilians, 10,000 terrorists killed.
Sure. And do you feel like I do that the distinction between civilian and Hamas fighter is a little bit blurry? Because of course there are going to be people who are just either children, and perhaps even if they are haters, they've been indoctrinated from birth. And there will be some people who just resent what Hamas have done. But it's worth noting that most IDF fighters have come into Gaza and come out have said they see vast majority support for Hamas, people aiding Hamas. We know that UNRWA there have been staff there that have been involved who would be classed as civilians. Do you think it's worth us raising this point as well? And we know from polling that there's mass support for Hamas, that of course we want to do everything we can to secure a sustainable long-term peace, but it's worth addressing this fact as well. Do you agree?
I do agree, and the laws of war are pretty clear on this point. The fact that civilians sympathise with or support Hamas does not make them lawful targets. It does not make them combatants. But if they actively assist Hamas, even if they're not members of Hamas, and it's very hard, although the IDF have very good intelligence on who is and who is not a member of Hamas, it is very hard to distinguish between Hamas and civilians. Physically, it's almost impossible because Hamas fighters wear civilian clothes. They don't wear any form of uniform when they're fighting. They often don't carry weapons. They will move from building to building where weapons are stashed without weapons and pick up a weapon when they get there, a grenade or a rocket launcher. They'll also, of course, move in tunnels from place to place. So they're often moving, and it's often impossible, if not, unless they're carrying a weapon, it's pretty much impossible to say for sure that somebody is a Hamas fighter, apart from maybe by their electronic signature from a phone call or radio or something like that. But the reality is that unless a civilian is actively assisting Hamas, that he or she is not a valid target for attack. But the minute he or she does assist Hamas, they lose their protection. They become viable targets, lawful targets. And that could include, for example, it could include hiding a weapon for Hamas. It could include carrying a weapon for Hamas. It could include any other warlike assistance to Hamas. But the truth is, that that I would say that the vast, although you said that the IDF have said that most of the people they've encountered in Gaza are supporters of Hamas. That I think is true from polling as well. It shows that the vast majority of people support Hamas inside Gaza. But we're now seeing, I think, a bit of a turning point, and I've certainly heard reports in the last few days, and indeed in the last few weeks, of many civilians beginning to turn on Hamas. Now, it's hard to turn on Hamas terrorists if you're just a normal civilian, but actually speaking out against Hamas and demanding that Hamas stop what they're doing because they realize what Hamas has brought to them, that is beginning to materialize now in a way it never has before.
Yeah, and I don't like when people say, well, they're too scared to speak up, and I do accept that, but at the same time, we have to give people some moral agency, and we can't just have this bigotry of low expectations. The people of Gaza, you have resistance movements. They should be resisting Hamas in the same way that you have in Iran a growing resistance movement to the sort of theocratic fascism that they experience. So then the other issue to think about and consider is this issue of sending in supplies. There's a growing movement in Israel that's objecting to the supplies that are going in every single day that often get into the wrong hands. What are the military morality, international law parameters around that kind of issue, and what's your own view of that?
Well, the reality is that Israel has a military right to deprive its enemy of supplies, and any supplies that it knows or believes are likely to get to the enemy, it has a right to stop that happening. At the same time, it does not have the legal right to prevent humanitarian aid getting to the civilian population. Of course, it's a very blurred issue because you can be pretty sure that virtually anything, for the reasons you've just said about how everyone says Hamas, people can't resist, can't stand up to Hamas, so people say, and therefore, how are they supposed to prevent Hamas getting humanitarian supplies to them? So it is a blurred issue, and there has to be a balance. I think it would not be unreasonable for Israel to lawfully prevent the majority of humanitarian aid getting into Gaza on the basis that it could get to Hamas. That would be a reasonable thing to do, I believe, and has occurred in many wars in the past. But of course, Israel is a humanitarian country. It has a very strong morality. It has care for the Palestinians. The Israeli government has made it clear many times that this is not a war on the Palestinians. And also, of course, in addition to its own morality, which would tend towards maybe taking some chances by allowing aid to be delivered to the Palestinian civilian population, Israel also has to keep, as far as it can, the rest of the world on side. And the rest of the world, the United States in particular, UK, European countries, they do expect to see Israel allowing humanitarian aid delivered. And so I think I can understand why people, particularly the families of hostages inside Gaza, might protest at aid going in there. I can understand why Israel does it, and I think it's the right thing for Israel to do. And I've been present in the last few weeks. I've been present at some of the positions where some of the entry points into Gaza that Israel is allowing aid through and checking aid, and Israel essentially is clearing and checking in a very efficient way as much aid as it possibly can to get into Gaza. The only reason that there is a blockage in aid at the moment is because of the UN agencies and aid agencies' inability to themselves facilitate as much aid as Israel can allow through. So that's where the blockage is. The blockage is in the inability of aid agencies rather than Israel in preventing aid going through.
And speaking of aid agencies, obviously there's been the announcement recently that many Western countries and others are going to stop funding UNRWA. What are your thoughts on that? I assume you would concur with that move, given their seeming Hamas collaboration.
UNRWA is effectively a front organization for Hamas. The majority of employees, as far as I'm aware, of UNRWA inside Gaza are Palestinian civilians. These are not some kind of external aid workers coming in that you could expect to behave impartially. These are Palestinian civilians, and like the majority of Palestinian civilians, as we discussed, they are supporters of Hamas. And UNRWA itself, as an organization, has effectively been a front organization for Hamas. And there are numerous reports. People like UN Watch have issued report after report warning the UN and member states about the complicity of UNRWA in terrorism. And you know, we talk about the number of people, number of Palestinian civilians that support Hamas. Well, they're indoctrinated almost from birth to support Hamas, including by anti-Israeli, anti-Jewish propaganda in UNRWA schools, in UN schools that we pay for. So it's absolutely abhorrent that UNRWA staff should have taken part in the atrocities on the 7th of October, but is in no way surprising. And we've seen UNRWA staff before facilitating and taking part in terrorist activities. So I thoroughly agree with those governments that have refused now to provide more support and aid to, and finance to UNRWA.
It makes us wonder why we give any credibility to the UN, to be honest, and even the ICJ, when their organizations are so deeply hostile and one-sided. I wanted to speak briefly about what your thoughts are as a military expert on the morning after scenario. What do you think Israel should do? What do you think will happen?
Well, of course, that depends on where this war ends, and of course, you know, it's still going on. It's still very furious. In some areas, the IDF are switching their operations to more focused, targeted special forces type raid operations. In other areas, they're still carrying out intensive combat as they've been doing up until now, depending on the combat situation in those areas. But at some point, this level of intensity of conflict will come to a conclusion. And that may be within the next few weeks or even possibly months, but it won't be, I don't think it's going to be that far ahead. Then, of course, there's going to be a long period of mopping up, of tracking down those terrorists who have melted back into the civilian population, who haven't been killed, haven't been captured, tracking them down and dealing with them. And also dismantling their infrastructure, of which there is vast amounts of infrastructure. I was in Gaza myself a few times during this conflict, and I was shown ordinary properties, civilian houses, apartment blocks, schools, hospitals, shops, where, in almost every single one, or every other one in some cases, there were weapons, there were munitions, there were supplies for Hamas, there were tunnel exits and entrances. All of this has got to be taken out and destroyed, or otherwise neutralized. And so once, you know, that process could go on for at least a year or possibly longer. But I'm not talking about a year of fighting. I'm talking about, maybe a few weeks or months more of fighting, and then a period of dismantling. So let's say once we get past the current intensity of fighting, irrespective of the dismantling of the Hamas infrastructure, Israel's got to maintain a permanent security presence in Gaza. The plan currently, as far as I'm aware, is to create a 1 to 2 kilometer buffer zone inside the Gaza border, all around the Gaza border, in which no one will move or do anything without the IDF's consent. And the IDF will have to police that, and will also probably have to police areas, if not the whole of Gaza itself. Either way, however that's tactically resolved, the IDF is going to have to maintain a permanent presence in Gaza. It cannot rely on any other organization, whether it's the United Nations, whether it's some kind of international alliance, the United States, or anyone else to secure Gaza for it, because otherwise we will see again what happened on the 7th of October. And of course, one of the, there are other issues as well as just direct security, one of which is, of course, the de-radicalization of Gaza, which the Israelis have specified as an objective. Whether that's achievable is another question, but it can't be achieved by Israel. For that, they're going to have to gain assistance and support from Arab countries, particularly, I would suggest, Saudi and the UAE. And then, of course, there's the reconstruction of Gaza, which is not something I don't believe Israel should have put on its shoulders. I think that is a matter for the international community, and particularly the Arab world, in trying to create some kind of reconstruction and some kind of governance mechanism for Gaza that does not include Hamas.
Fascinating. Colonel Kemp, lastly, I just want to ask you just more broadly. You've been a staunch defender of Israel and the IDF on the world stage for quite a while now. I remember following you even when I was a student at school, and even invited you to speak at my school over a decade ago. Some people will wonder, you're a non-Jewish Brit. Why do you support Israel so much?
It was a great pleasure, Ollie, to speak at your school and also to other Jewish schools. I spoke just a few days ago at Emmanuel College, which I don't think it wasn't yours, but you were JFS, I believe.
I was Habs, but Emmanuel's nearby.
I beg your pardon, Habs. Yes, same thing, different name. But no, and it's always a pleasure to speak at Jewish schools, because Jewish students, they get so much bombardment with anti-Israel propaganda that they do need to hear the truth. And the truth is, as far as I'm able to tell it, is what I can say to them. And I base that on, and this is really answering your question as well, I base that on 30 years of military experience fighting very similar enemies in some cases to the enemies Israel's fighting now. So I understand the reality. I know the IDF very, very well. I've observed them in action in Gaza, outside Gaza, in different places, and I understand how they operate. And I know I've explained, their morality, and I've explained the way they try and act effectively, but killing the minimum number of innocent civilians they can possibly do. And all that is not understood by many people and has to be explained. And why would I go to the trouble of explaining it as a non-Jew, as a goy, and a non-Israeli? Well, the reason is fairly simple. When I was a child, I was taught right from wrong, and I was taught that if I am in a position to do something about something that is wrong, I have a duty to do it. And very clearly to me, Israel here is in the right, and the anti-Israel lobby is in the wrong. I have my own knowledge and experience, which I can use to do what I can to address this wrong. And obviously, my contribution is small, but at least it's something. And the second, two other issues. One is, we owe Israel a great deal. Great Britain and Israel's other allies have benefited enormously from, apart from any trade or technology, benefited enormously from Israeli intelligence, which has saved the lives of many British citizens, whether it's in Iraq, Afghanistan, or here at home or elsewhere in the world. We have benefited also from Israeli military technology, military techniques that they've shared with us. And all of that, they're a friend, they're an ally. We're very close to Israel militarily and in intelligence terms. And why would I not do what I can to support a close ally, exactly as I would with the US? And the third reason why I believe this is so important is because Israel's fighting the same fight that we're all fighting. The same ideology that Hamas is using to try and inflict a genocide on Israel is the ideology of the Islamic State, of Al-Qaeda, of many of the jihadists we fought, and of many jihadists who are active in this country to try and carry out terrorist attacks here. And we've seen numerous terrorist attacks. We've seen even more stopped. But we're fighting the same fight. And if Hamas is allowed to flourish and prevail here, that will inspire jihadists who want to fight against us. And I didn't mention Iran. I should have done. Iran, of course, Britain, Israel, and the US are sworn enemies of Iran. We don't swear that we're the enemy of Iran. We are the enemies of the Iranian regime. But America's the great Satan, and Britain and Israel are the two little Satans. And the British part in that is not often brought out, but it's just as we are just as much an anathema to them as Israel and the US are. And so, again, Israel is fighting in fighting Hamas, in fighting Hezbollah, in fighting the Houthis in Yemen and other Iranian proxies. Israel is fighting Iran, and therefore it's our fight as well.
Wow, amazing. Just lastly, and this really is the last question. you touched on at the start that really, and I think you're right, all the arguments here on Israel really boils down to who has the right to the land. And I've seen you even feature in videos and talk about the importance of the Jewish people's right to the land of Israel. Could you just elaborate on that for a minute and your thoughts on that, and also why it's so important?
Yeah, I mean, and it's quite intricate, and it's quite complex, and it's too often misunderstood. But the first thing I would say is that the Jews did not steal any land from the Palestinians. The land that is owned by the Jews in this country, in Israel, was purchased by Jews, um, or was either purchased by Jews or it had belonged to Jews for many generations. The issue of land theft is a complete fabrication. The political situation, when people say that Israel does not have that Israel, let's say, is illegal occupiers of Judea and Samaria, illegal settlers, or illegal occupiers of Gaza, which is an even more difficult case to make, as Israel left Gaza back in 2005 totally. But even that is a fabrication, because and again, this is a fairly complex issue, but in 1947 the UN partition plan was put forward, which Israel accepted, giving some of the land to Israel, some of it to the Arabs. The Arabs rejected that partition plan, and they rejected it by invading with 5 Arab armies, and eventually not succeeding in their objective of annihilating the Jewish presence inside Israel. But because they rejected it, that plan never came into effect. And what that means is that under international legal precedent, the entire land that was previously under the sovereignty of Great Britain in the UN, I beg your pardon, in the League of Nations mandate after the First World War, which encompassed the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, Gaza, and the rest of Israel, the entirety of that land was inherited by the new sovereign, which was Israel after Britain left. And so, of course, there's still question marks as to who should be controlling what, etc. But until there is a settlement between Israel and the Arabs and the Palestinians, shall we say, that land is under Israeli sovereignty. It's not occupied. It's not illegally occupied by Israel. There's no illegal settlements. It is under Israeli sovereignty. At some point in the future, maybe at some point in the distant future, there might be a formal division of the territory. I don't know. But for the time being, Israel has every right to that land, and it has legal right and as well as property rights to the land, both through international law and historical precedent.
Fascinating. And I think because the Arab world are a religious world, really the only argument they're actually going to hear and respect is going to be a religious one, in terms of the Jewish people's relationship with God, basically, and the land. And I think that's the only thing that's they're gonna really respect, and what we're sort of being pushed towards, because they don't have much appreciation in that world for international law and the Western institutions and League of Nations and all that. But
Well, sorry, if you don't mind me making a comment on that. We should understand. We should not understand this as a land war. It's not a war over land. This is a religious war. It's in Islamic doctrine, any territory that has once been controlled by Islam can never be controlled by anybody else. And the Ottoman Empire, most recently, until the British took control of the territory in a defensive war in the First World War, the Ottoman Empire, which was a Islamic entity, was sovereign there. And of course, there have been Muslim sovereign there before. So under that doctrine, that land cannot be controlled now by Jews, and it's Muslims' obligation to remove the Jews from it. And that's what this war is all about. The land war and the War of National Liberation was an invention in the 1960s of the Soviet Union. And they created the Palestinian people. They wrote the Palestinian National Charter in Moscow with collaboration from Egypt, and they invented the whole Palestinian Arab identity, which had never existed before the 1960s, and that was intended, that whole movement, which the Soviet Union invested millions and millions of rubles in, was intended as a means of undermining Israel, but not specifically undermining Israel, undermining US and UK influence through their friends and allies inside Israel. And that's the situation we're faced with today. It's a religious war, and it's been stoked and fueled by the Soviet Union back in the 60s.
Absolutely, completely agree, and that's why I think as Jews, the Jewish people needs to offer a religious answer to them, because that's the only thing that they'll respect. But Colonel Kemp, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for everything you do for the Jewish people, for the Western world, for all of humanity, really. And please continue to keep spreading your light. And we really, I think I can speak on behalf of the Jewish people. We say a massive, massive thank you to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ollie. It's been a pleasure.